Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Good day, everybody, and welcome back to the Pat Flynn Show. I hope you are ready for a fascinating episode, because we're going to talk about everything from near-death experience to the fine-tuning of the universe to how to suffer well in moments of pain, in moments in life, times in life, periods of life that just don't seem to be going the way that we want them to. My guest is Father Robert J. Spitzer. He has his Ph.D. in philosophy of science. He has got his master's in theology, his master's in philosophy, his master's in divinity. The man is a walking brain. His knowledge is encyclopedic. And the reason I invited Father Spitzer to come on is because one of the most common requests I get, and indeed it's one of the most common holdups for people when it comes to the religious worldview, is they think that there is some type of conflict. There is some alleged conflict between the religious worldview and the scientific worldview. Now, what I would like to say is that of course, is they think that there is some type of conflict. There is some alleged conflict between the religious worldview and the scientific worldview. Now, what I would like to say is that of course, is just a complete and total fabrication. It's a myth. But nevertheless, it's an impression that many people hold, so we have to do what we can to dispel this myth and show that, in fact, it's completely the opposite that's true. As we advance our scientific understanding, when we learn to really think about the world, we will see that it is not only reasonable to have faith and believe in God, but that might actually be the only reasonable position that you can hold. So I have Father Spitzer joining me, and let me just give you the right expectations for this episode, because the first half is a bit technical. He goes into sort of the scene of contemporary modern cosmology, looking specifically at the fine-tuning of the universe and how this seems to strongly suggest that it was all really designed for our being here. It's just very eerily suspicious. I think you'll find that very fascinating if you're not familiar with what's known as the fine-tuning of the universe that has been discovered in just the past couple of recent decades, really. So we do that, and then we talk a little philosophy, a little natural theology. So the first half of this episode is a bit more technical, but I think it's accessible still and should be interesting to anybody who is wanting to understand the relation between faith and reason or faith and science. And then beyond that, we get into something that I think is going to really captivate all of you, and that's the phenomenon of near-death experiences and terminal lucidity. Father Spitzer has done a lot of research into this area. He understands it really well. And the reason is because, as we will explore in this episode, these phenomena just cannot be explained in physicalist terms. There's something more going on here to, say, a transphysical soul. So if you haven't really explored near-death experiences and the research and the studies that have gone on, then this will be a good crash course for you, and I think that they'll really get you thinking. They will. So we spend some time on that, and then towards the end of the episode, we take a turn into theology, and I scooped up a number of questions that have been sitting in my inbox or social media outlets, I guess you could call them, that focus on everything from how to suffer well, what to do in times of suffering. Also questions of eschatology, questions of, I'm trying to remember now because it's actually been a minute since we've done this done this episode, but it's good. So the last part is theological in nature. But I think you're gonna love all of it. I do. Again, the theology things become a lot more certainly practical on one level, but captivating for for just about everybody. So here, I'm just going to be quiet now because I don't know why I've even rambled this long, but we'll let Tom Cruise kick off the intro, and then we will be hearing my interview and conversation with Father Robert J. Spitzer. Enjoy.
Ready to become better than most people and most things? Welcome to the Pat Flynn Show. Best-selling author, entrepreneur, fitness expert, and philosopher Pat Flynn teaches you how to learn and become amazing at almost everything through the concept of generalism, acquiring and stacking skills that will help you dominate in business and life. Want to get in shape? Write a book? Be a better precog division officer? Or simply launch a successful business empire? Well, sit back, relax, and listen as Pat and his guests offer digestible and entertaining insights on how to learn the skills, tactics, and strategies you need to pursue your goals and achieve the life you've always wanted.
Well, hello, everybody, and welcome back. I have to say I'm really glad to be talking to Father Spitzer today. I have become something of an EWTN fanatic, and I would have never have thought that that's where life would have taken me, but here we are, and I'm so glad that it has. Father Spitzer, thank you for taking the time to join me today.
Oh, my absolute honor, Pat. Thank you for inviting me.
So you are somebody, well, you're my favorite kind of guest because you're somebody that it's hard to even start a conversation with because there's so many different things that I want to talk to you about. There's just so many questions that I want to ask you. But before we get into it, and I know we'll get into some philosophy and a lot of the work that you've done, which I'm just kind of maybe catch the listeners up on who you are and what you do and how you got to be doing it.
Well, I'm a Jesuit priest, and I formally studied and did my Ph.D. in philosophy of science, particularly in the area of time theory and its relationship to general relativity, and then went on to teach at Georgetown University, and eventually became president of Gonzaga University for 11 years. And then because, I looked at the Pew survey of 2012 and then later 2014, got very, very concerned about the number of people who were actually becoming agnostics and atheists among religious people, Catholics, Protestants, and so forth. And because there's just later 2014, got very, very concerned about the number of people who were actually becoming agnostics and atheists among religious people, Catholics, Protestants, and so forth. And because there's just so much scientific evidence, I mean, a veritable plethora of evidence from both contemporary physics, cosmology, as well as metaphysics and logic, I just decided, I really wanted to get into this and do some modules in this area. And so I wrote some books and articles, a lot of articles for International Philosophical Quarterly on philosophical proofs of God, and then a book called New Proofs for the Existence of New Proofs for the Existence of God from Physics and Philosophy. And then lately I just in all these areas, but basically it should be pretty accessible to somebody with a college education who has an interest, in both science and metaphysics, proofs for the existence of God, evidence for God from science, etc.
So, Father Spitzer, if you don't mind, I'd like to go down that direction a little bit. Where would you start somebody who has sort of fallen into, unfortunately, what I think has become a very mainstream narrative, that there is some type of alleged conflict between the religious worldview and the scientific worldview? Where do you start to expose that conflict as being really just what it is, just an alleged one or a superficial one? How do you begin that conversation?
Well, first of all, you have to challenge some of the myths that are out there, and one of the myths is that most scientists are atheists, and that gives most scientists are not atheists. Frankly, the last poll from the American Association for the Advancement of Science indicated that 51% of scientists are theists. And there is a large number who are agnostic, but not atheist, and that remaining 49%. So really a minority of scientists are atheists. Mm-hmm. And so you also have to challenge things like, the Catholic Church is against science, which is somehow drawn as an implication from the Galileo affair. Mm-hmm. But in point of fact, the Catholic Church couldn't be against science because of Galileo, because Galileo was proposing the heliocentric solar system. And the heliocentric solar system was not first proposed by Galileo. The first mathematical justification was done by Copernicus, who would have to challenge things like, the Catholic Church is against science, which is somehow drawn as an implication from the Galileo affair. Mm-hmm. But in point of fact, the Catholic Church couldn't be against science because of Galileo, because Galileo was proposing the heliocentric solar system. And the heliocentric solar system was not first proposed by Galileo. The first mathematical justification was done by Copernicus, who was a Catholic cleric. So, hello. He wasn't condemned, and he led to the Copernican revolution that Galileo actually participated in. Mm-hmm. The real problem was the publication by Galileo that this had been a proven fact when the Pope had asked him not to do it, until he really did have the facts. And that didn't come, of course, until the 1800s. So he really did have the facts. And that didn't come, of course, until the 1800s when Betts used stellar parallax to prove it. So to make a long story short again, we've got so many other priests, who are involved in science from the very beginning, including Gregor Mendel, who was the father of what's called quantitative genetics. He was not only a priest, but an abbot of a religious monastery. You have Nicholas Steno, who is the father of contemporary geology and stratigraphy. He was a Danish Catholic bishop. You've got Monsignor Georges Lemaitre, Father Georges Lemaitre, who was a Belgian priest who discovered, he was the first person to discover and publish the Big Bang Theory with its mathematical justification. Now, it's true that at the time, Einstein did say that his creation that he had ever heard. So, Monsignor Lemaitre was vindicated. And by the way, we have a Pontifical Academy of Sciences that has lots and lots of Nobel Prize winners and Templeton Prize winners. So, the idea that the Church is against science has never been against science. And the Jesuits, the religious order, Catholic religious order I belong to, certainly haven't been against science. We have an observatory in Rome, and we've got one down at the University of Arizona, right outside of Tucson there. And, which is making bipolar observations, in conjunction with other observatories. And we have a whole bunch of physicists to this very day who are priests, not only writing, but also teaching and so forth. So the first thing is you kind of have to bust the myth. That somehow, Christianity in general, or significant figures in the development of science, and not to mention, the members of the Pontifical Academy of Science. So, these are just a few things that I'd probably start with before going into the evidence. And then, today, like I said, the plethora of evidence from science needs to be really just displayed for all to see. Wonderful people like Luke Barnes, Dr. Luke Barnes, has written a book called Fortunate Universe and things of that nature, which they're really good books. And these are a high degree of professional physicists who really do explore, the need for transcendent intelligence as an ultimate explanation for the fine-tuning of the universe. I have, a chapter on that in my book, New Proofs for the Existence of God, for transcendent intelligence as an ultimate explanation for the fine-tuning of the universe. I have, a chapter on that in my book, New Proofs for the Existence of God. And as I just said, I made a recent contribution to another volume that's just coming out right now called Theism and Atheism on that very subject. There is a lot of evidence, far too much to describe right now in a 1-hour podcast. But for the moment, suffice it to say that if you please just go to my book or just go to this website called crediblecatholic.com. That's crediblecatholic.com. Just click on the big book. And then from the big book, just go ahead and click on Module 1 and read to your heart's content. All that stuff there is free of charge.
And
you can get...
I was just going to say it's a wonderful resource. It's a wonderful website. So I'm going to make sure that we link credible. If we could just spend a few more minutes, because this is such an interesting topic, and I love the way that your book, New Proofs for the Existence of God, for example, you deal with both the scientific and philosophical, the sort of contemporary scene of the scientific and philosophical evidence for God. But what I found is when you bring up the term fine tuning, is this is sort of unfamiliar to a lot of people. These sort of recent cosmological discoveries of the past couple decades. So what do we mean when we say that the universe is fine tuned?
Yeah, it means it's fine-tuned for life. And that there are two kinds of variables that we have in our universe, and they're you might call them free parameters, is what the scientists would call it. We would just, in an equation, it's a variable. So there's nothing there, but there's also what we call fixed parameters that for whatever reason we don't know. That's the basic thought. Yet they are fixed to precisely where they need to be in order for a life form to develop in our universe. Let me just give you some examples. For example, entropy is really needed for any life form to develop in our universe. And entropy means a high degree of organization. And it's a well-known area of physics called thermodynamics. But just to take right now, my simple explanation is you need this kind of physical organization in order for an energetic system to do anything, to be able to do what we might call work. So you have to have entropy and a lot of you have to have a lot of free energy there that is in the system in order for work to be done. Now, here's the problem. Entropy, this is a law that is irreversible, right? Entropy, basically, every time a physical system does some work, it loses a little bit of that necessary free energy available to do work. And so at the end of the day, once entropy gets high enough, right? Once a physical system like the universe has done, a certain amount of work, entropy, which is irreversible, and that's the breakdown of free energy, right? The loss of free energy, it begins to have its effect until finally it becomes maximal or optimal entropy, at which point the physical system can't finally. It becomes maximal or optimal entropy, at which point the physical system can't do any work anymore. Now, you really do need then low entropy in the universe. You need a lot of free energy in our universe in order for things to work. Now, here's the problem. In order to get a lot of free energy and, at the very beginning of the universe, and the beginning of our universe is what we call the Big Bang that occurred 13.8 billion years ago. It's very much against the odds, right? It's a high degree of organization. And so, low entropy, the odds against low entropy, which are absolutely necessary, right? You need high, free energy, low entropy in your universe as an initial condition. Well, the odds against it is calculated by Roger Penrose that came at Oxford University, who did this low entropy in your universe as an initial condition. Well, the odds against it is calculated by Roger Penrose that came at Oxford University, who did this a while back, I think in 1989. He calculated this, and the calculation still stands, right? The odds against low entropy in our universe, so necessary for life, is 10 raised to the 10 raised to the 123 to 1 against. That's a double exponent. I mean, if you were to write out that number, right, it would be a 1 followed by 123 zeros in the exponent. If you were to write that number without an exponent, well, I mean, our solar system could not hold that number if every zero were 10-point type. I mean, this is an extraordinary, it's the same odds as a monkey typing the entire corpus of Shakespeare by random tapping of the keys in a single try. I mean, our solar system could not hold that number if every zero were 10-point type. I mean, this is an extraordinary, it's the same odds as a monkey typing the entire corpus of Shakespeare by random tapping of the keys in a single try. Now, that is seriously against the odds. Now, if we need low entropy for life to occur, and that low entropy, so necessary for life, is the same odds as a monkey typing the entire corpus of Shakespeare by random tapping of the keys in a single try, you got a problem, an explanatory problem. I mean, fine-tuned conditions, they call for an explanation. This kind of fine-tuning screams out for an explanation. And the explanation is not contained within the universe itself that we can see. There have been no shortage of trillions of other bubble universes, and we just, there happens to be 10 to the 123 bubble universes in that multiverse, and we just got lucky, and we're the one. We are the one out of 10 to the 10 to the 123 that actually had constants for life. Well, now you look at that essentially and you say, well, I guess that's a plausible explanation. A multiverse is that, where you don't have to make, an appeal to a supernatural or transcendent God, a supernatural or transcendent intelligence to do that. Now, there is one problem, though. And that is when you deal with the low entropy problem, the multiverse cannot explain this in any way that will not give rise to what's called either a Boltzmann brain or a brief brain. In other words, your appearance, an appeal to a supernatural or transcendent God, a supernatural or transcendent intelligence to do that. Now, there is one problem, though. And that is when you deal with the low entropy problem, the multiverse cannot explain this in any way that will not give rise to what's called either a Boltzmann brain or a brief brain. In other words, your appearance, Pat, in this world, your appearance as you are in a world that's just filled with a luxury of free energy and low entropy everywhere you look, your appearance is much, much, much more improbable than if you were a Boltzmann brain that simply came into being for a few moments with all of your memories loaded about what the universe looks like and all the scientists who've reported on it, and just accompanied by another problem called brief brains, but I won't get into it now. The main thing is, right now, it is not unreasonable. It is not irrational. It is not irresponsible to believe in a transcendent intelligence as an ultimate explanation for these fine-tuning coincidences like, for example, the low entropy of our universe at the Big Bang. And so, if the multiverse doesn't work, and by the way, it really doesn't, and if bouncing universes don't work, and there's a huge amount of evidence for why they don't work, especially as an explanation for fine tuning, and if there is no such thing as what might be called a theory of everything that explains, which there isn't. Right. And if you can't use, what's called, inflationary miracles to explain it, which you can't, and all these work, especially as an explanation for fine tuning. And if there is no such thing as what might be called a theory of everything that explains, which there isn't. Right. And if you can't use, what's called, inflationary miracles to explain it, which you can't, and all these things, by the way, if you're interested in the scientific and physical explanation for this, take a look at that book that's just coming out called Theism and Atheism. Mm-hmm. Just read my article called Fine-Tuning and Transcendent Intelligence. And I talk about why those things will not work. Then God, that is to say the transcendent intelligence hypothesis, is the best explanation that you're going to be able to get. And the most reasonable and responsible explanation. And you might say, well, what about Dawkins' rejoinder that a designer would always have to be argument on the face of it, except the first premise is just dead wrong. Though the second premise, no one will argue with, right? Whatever's more complex is more improbable. But the idea that a designer has to be more complex than what it designs, I mean, that premise was refuted by St. Thomas Aquinas in the 1200s. Mm-hmm. Are you kidding me? I mean, the whole notion of simplicity and intelligence being a non-complex reality, and now today with quantum fields, I mean, we're talking about looking at mind-like realities that are devoid of complexity. I mean, somehow Dawkins forgot to read, his quantum theory. So essentially, I explained this, by the way, in that book, New Proofs for the Existence of God. Just take a look at chapter number 3 when I talk about the new proofs for the existence of God. Just take a look at chapter number 3 when I talk about the metaphysical proof of God's existence. I explain the principle of simplicity. But also, if you want to go back to crediblecatholic.com and just click on module 1. Go to the big book and then click on big book volume 1. Mm-hmm. Just go down to where it says a contemporary Thomistic metaphysical proof of God. Well, the whole thing is explained right there.
And Father Spitzer, if you don't mind, two things. I would like to dive into that argument, even if just briefly, because I read the essay that you sent over to me, and I found it absolutely fascinating. It's one of my favorite forms of, I guess it's a type of contingency argument, right? Would you say?
Yeah. And yeah, it is. It's a contingency argument, but also, you see, the thing. Well, let me give you this is called the high flying. The whole thing is go to the argument on crediblecatholic.com. Mm-hmm. But here's the basic premise. In the first premise, what is shown by a metaphysician, right, is that you have to have at least one unconditioned reality in the whole of reality. An unconditioned reality means one that is not dependent on any other reality for its existence. Mm-hmm. So in other words, it exists through itself. Mm-hmm. So that's the first thing. And you can prove that quite conclusively. And for those, who are just, wondering, well, how do you do it? I'm begging you, just either go to chapter 3 of my book, New Proofs for the Existence of God, or just click on Credible Catholic and go to the big book and go right down to the Thomistic proof. The second premise of the work is to show that whatever is unconditioned has to be what we might call unrestrictedly intelligible. Now, contain within itself the complete set of correct answers to the complete set of questions. Mm-hmm. In other words, it has to explain within itself. If it can explain its own being, if it's existing through itself, then it must be able to explain being itself through which it exists. Mm-hmm. And it's a complex argument. I admit it, but once you kind of master the vocabulary behind it, you can begin to see that, hey, wait a minute, this is actually the case. There's no question that whatever is unconditioned is unrestrictedly intelligible. Mm-hmm. Then the third premise shows you can only have one unrestrictedly intelligible reality. And the reason for that is if you're going to have a difference between realities, so let's suppose you have unrestricted the vocabulary behind it, you can begin to see that, hey, wait a minute, this is actually the case. There's no question that whatever is unconditioned is unrestrictedly intelligible. Mm-hmm. Then the third premise shows you can only have one unrestrictedly intelligible reality. And the reason for that is if you're going to have a difference between realities, so let's suppose you have unrestricted reality number 1 and unrestricted reality number 2, you're going to have a difference between them. So multiplicity implies a difference between the realities. Now, if you have a difference between them, then one of them is going to have something, be somewhere, be in another dimension that the other one is not. But if that other one is not something, or they must be restricted. And again, that's proven there in the proof I sent you, and also in Credible Catholic. I better ask permission. I just submitted that proof that I sent you to IPQ, so I'm going to get a permission. But if I do, you can put it right up there on your website.
Oh, great! It seems like it's a further development of the one that you have in your new proofs book as well.
That's correct.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's a further development, and it's just a little clearer one, and all the logical steps are set out there so that people can really get it. But I mean, once you get to the fourth step, I mean, you're there. The fourth step just simply shows not only that you have to have one and only one unconditioned, unrestrictedly intelligible reality, but that the unrestrictedly intelligible reality must be a perfectly simple, and here's what we get, that is to say, non-complex, unrestricted act of thinking itself. Now you go, well, why does that have to be? You just got to look at the proof on the website or in the book, or if I can get permission, just look at it on your website. And the proof is given there. And then the fifth step of the proof is that, well, wait a minute. If you can only have one unconditioned reality that exists through itself, and it has to be unrestrictedly intelligible, which is perfectly simple and unrestricted intelligence, then every other reality in the whole of reality cannot be that one and only one unconditioned, unrestrictedly intelligible reality. And if it's not that one unconditioned, unrestrictedly intelligible reality, then, it has to have a cause of its existence. So I don't assume the principle and unrestricted intelligence. Then, every other reality in the whole of reality cannot be that one and only one unconditioned, unrestrictedly intelligible reality. And if it's not that one unconditioned, unrestrictedly intelligible reality, then, it has to have a cause of its existence. So I don't assume the principle of causation. I prove the principle of causation. Mm-hmm. If you only have one reality that exists through itself, then every single other reality in the whole of reality must exist through a cause. Mm-hmm. It's not existing through itself. It has to exist through something outside of itself. And if it exists outside of through something outside of itself, ultimately it must be reduced back to the one thing that does exist through itself. In which case, the one unconditioned stops thinking about us or our universe for but a microsecond. Poof, we're gone, vaporized into nothingness. Well, it alone, through its own process of thought, is keeping us in being. Yeah, and that's sort of an overview of the proof.
Well, it is a technical argument, and it's a challenging and rewarding read for any person who has an interest in philosophy or natural theology, and as somebody who is very influenced by the work of Aquinas and contemporary Thomists, and I absolutely spend probably far too much time studying these types of arguments. I find your development really powerful. Really, it's hard to get across in a simple way, but I think, for example, as opposed to a simple, 3-step Kalam argument or something like that, but it's airtight. So if we can't get the permission to share the article, then I would highly encourage people to go that. But it's airtight. So if we can't get the permission to share the article, then I would highly encourage people to go, if you're interested in this line of thought, to check it out in your book, New Proofs for the Existence of God, as well.
You bet. Or even crediblecatholic.com, Big Book Volume 1.
That's also a great resource. So, Father Spitzer, I'm sure people's brains are on fire right now. We talked about fine-tuning and physics, and in this very high-minded philosophical series of deductions leads to an existence of an unconditioned reality that just so happens to match up with what most people think about God. So here's where I'd like to shift the conversation now, because I think this is something that everybody will be able to grasp and relate to. And it's something that deeply intrigued me. And then when I found out that even when I was a skeptic, even before I converted to Catholicism, the phenomenon of near-death experiences always intrigued me. And then I realized you have something of here's where I'd like to shift the conversation now, because I think this is something that everybody will be able to grasp and relate to. And it's something that deeply intrigued me. And then when I found out that even when I was a skeptic, even before I converted to Catholicism, the phenomenon of near-death experiences always intrigued me. And then I realized you have something of an expertise in that. And the arguments that you make is that near-death experiences are real experiences that do not have plausible naturalistic explanations for them and are very, very strong evidence pointing toward the existence of a transphysical soul. So could you talk to us about that? Because I think that's something everybody has an interest in, and itself provides some very powerful and persuasive evidence to at least some type of transcendent dimension.
You bet, Pat. I mean, here's the, if you just go to crediblecatholic.com, go to the big book, just click on module 2, and everything I'm going to say is right there. There are two different kinds. Their heart has stopped. 30 seconds after that, their brain is beginning to shut, not even 30 seconds, right? They're going to have a flat EEG by 30 seconds. And, after their heart has stopped, that means there's going to be no electrical activity in their cerebral cortex. They're going to have fixed and dilated pupils, no gag reflex, mere sputterings of neurons in the lower brain. So what you're dealing with is a person who is incapable of cognitional, visual, auditory, activity, memory, et cetera, et cetera. So during that period, when this person, is what we might call near brain death, and certainly physically, we call it, clinically dead. And because they're clinically dead, because they're so near to brain death that they really are incapable of any physically. We call it clinically dead, and because they're clinically dead because they're so near to brain death that they really are incapable of any physical activity or cognitional activity. Then what happens is this transphysical soul leaves their body. It has extension. It can see, and in fact, it can see 360. It can hear. It can remember. All of its memories are intact. So whether it's a he or a she, he can remember his memories, and he can recall what's happening to him in that state. Now, you might say, well, that's, due to anoxia, which is a deprivation of oxygen, or it's due to, hallucination effects, for morphine or other kinds of, pharmaceuticals that have been given to the person, to try and revive them, or some other, physical explanation. But actually, there are 4 mitigating factors that seem to rule out a physicalist explanation. The first one is what's called just veridical evidence itself, where you actually have people reporting unique things that go on, during when they're clinically dead, when they're incapable of seeing, hearing, or cognitional activity. They can report things 100% accurately. And so I've quoted all the studies. If you just go to module 2 there, or if you go to the Soul's Upward Yearning, chapter 5, all the studies are quoted there. I've got 28 studies of this, of these phenomena. I mean, they're really quite remarkable. Some guy just passes right through the hospital walls, and or actually, it was a woman who passed through the hospital walls in this case, and she's looking back, at the hospital, sees a sneaker on the ledge of this with red hair, took the dentures out of my mouth. She opened the drawer underneath the machine that looks like X, Y, and Z, threw the dentures in, and slammed the drawer, but it was right there in the operating room. And of course, they go down to the operating room, open that drawer, find the dentures, and identify the nurse who put them there. Now, how would he know? I mean, and so forth and so on. I mean, this goes on and on. But the second kind of data, that mitigates or militates, against, a physicalist explanation is that 81% of blind people, according to the Kenneth Ring study, 81% of blind people see for the first time when they're clinically dead.
Yeah, wow.
Now, this is truly extraordinary because you're never going to explain this with a hallucination or anoxia or something of that nature, or even stimulus of the temporal lobe, because blind data, that mitigates or militates, against, a physicalist explanation is that 81% of blind people, according to the Kenneth Rain study, 81% of blind people see for the first time when they're clinically dead.
Yeah, wow.
Now, this is truly extraordinary because you're never going to explain this with a hallucination or anoxia or something of that nature, or even stimulus of the temporal lobe, because blind people don't have any visual images in their memories to project in a hallucination or some stimulation of one of the lobes of the brain, etc. It just, they're not there. So how, for the first time, do they suddenly have these very accurate visual images that they, by the way, they've been checked out by independent researchers after the fact that show that what they saw outside, for example, if you go to, our modules, the 7 essential modules on the same crediblecatholic.com, we've got some interviews with some kids, who are blind from birth, and the kid is going, well, I just went through the hospital walls and I saw for the first time snow. I've heard snow on the ground. I've touched it, but I've never seen it before. And I saw these tracks from a train that were sitting there in the snow, and there were trees on either side of the tracks, and there was a train that was moving, away from the hospital at the time when I was dead. Well, of course, you can verify every last one of those facts, and he's 100% right. My question is, without the capacity, without a visual image in his brain, how in the world was he able to do that and report the train going right through the area? The important too is the studies that have been done, especially on children who have had a near-death experience. Now, interestingly, 85% of children have a near-death experience who undergo clinical death. Only 20% of adults do. It could be for all kinds of reasons, but children who have a near-death experience, you can measure what's called natural death anxiety by basically an altered polygraph. You can sort of fix it up to measure, the sympathetic nervous system's response to natural death images and so forth. Well, in the normal population, right, we do have, a good deal of death anxiety and measurable death anxiety. Not children. Children absolutely have, who have had a near-death experience, actually have polygraph. You can sort of fix it up to measure, the sympathetic nervous system's response to natural death images and so forth. Well, in the normal population, right, we do have, a good deal of death anxiety and measurable death anxiety. Not children. Children absolutely have, who have had a near-death experience, actually have no death anxiety at all. Now, here's what's bizarre. Death anxiety is subconscious. It's not conscious. Now, if it were conscious, you could say, well, a religious person will have less conscious death anxiety. And that's true. But they don't have less subconscious death anxiety. That subconscious death anxiety is part of an initial group of symbols and reactions and things that's beneath the surface. You don't lose it. So even religious people mean unmeasurable death anxiety. Now, subconscious death anxiety. How? I mean, you can't voluntarily control this. And the only thing that they have in common, by the way, and it goes throughout the whole of their lives, the only thing they have in common is they had a near-death experience. They experienced the white light. They experienced a loving being, or they had an experience of Jesus or deceased relatives. I mean, these are the common experiences that happen to people after they leave the hospital room or leave the ambiance in which they are. or they're being revived or resuscitated. But the point I'm trying to get to is, again, it's inexplicable from a physical point of view. So, and finally, you've got reports of. Anyway, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. You keep going. I'll save my question for after you.
I just aim for our teddy bear, whatever it might have been, and so forth. And she'll know that was me. And so the kid goes back. He says, "Oh, Mom, I saw Aunt so and so." Well, how did you know you had an Aunt so and so? She died before you were born. Oh, she came, greeted me, and said, "Hey, your secret name for your teddy bear is X." And of course, she's just blown away. Well, at the University of Virginia Medical School, they've just done, hundreds of studies. Grayson and the two doctors Kelly have done remarkable studies on these things, as well as other near-death experience studies. So, how do you explain it? It's just seemingly inexplicable, unless they're having that transphysical experience, not only of what's incidents going on in the hospital room or outside the hospital or whatever, but studies. So, how do you explain it? It's just seemingly inexplicable, unless they're having that transphysical experience, not only of what's incidents going on in the hospital room or outside the hospital or whatever, but also in an area beyond with a loving white light or deceased relatives, etc.
So my question was this: I heard of near-death experiences before, and that got me interested, and that eventually led to your work. But when you really dive into it, you realize, oh wow, the evidence here is really strong. Why isn't this talked about more? Why isn't this more well studied? Because it seems so utterly significant that you think everybody should be hopping on this. But perhaps I just don't think it's talked about to the degree that it's significant to me. I wonder why that is.
Well, I think because
significant to me. I wonder why that is.
Well, I think because the physicalist bias in the scientific community is still pretty strong. Mm-hmm. Now, I think there is a reason for a physicalist bias in the scientific community, because basically every scientist should try to explain a phenomenon, right, as best he can by, what we call the known forces or processes of nature. So we try to explain everything we can through a physicalist process, and we try to a physical process, and we try to do our very best to keep open to a physical process if we don't know one. But when you start getting contravening evidence, which suggests strongly that a physical process can't explain, getting contravening evidence, which suggests strongly that a physical process can't explain it, then an honest person will start changing their minds. And by the way, this is happening a lot in the medical community, because it's just almost undeniable at this point, even though some of the guys who talk about it, these doctors who talk about it, they're kind of attacked by colleagues. But right now, you have no shortage of peer-reviewed medical journal articles on a near-death phenomena. I mean, the one published by Samuel Parnia and his 10 co-authors, it was Southampton University in England, was a strong study with 2005 patients and reported in peer-reviewed journal. Dr. Pim von Lommel, very strong study with hundreds of patients or a hallucination. And in my book, The Soul's Upward Yearning, and also in Module 2, if you go to that module number 2 in the big book of crediblecatholic.com, I go through 7 different explanations that are the big physicalist explanations, and just say, no, these 4, vertical kinds of data that I just talked about, they're not explained by hallucination or anoxia or stimulation of the lobe of the brain or, other kinds of factors, which I take up in that book. So I think it basically is a bias, but the bias is breaking down. It's just like in science. right, among physicists and scientists. Let's face it, only 20 years ago, I think it was 42% of scientists were declared theists. Today, 51%. 20 years ago, I think it was 42% of scientists were declared theists. Today, 51% of scientists are declared theists.
Wow.
Now, part of that might be due to near-death experience. I know for the physicists, it has a lot to do with the fine-tuning evidence and also what's called the Bordelenkinen and Guth proof combined with entropy evidence for a beginning. So there is a lot of very good evidence that's kind of turning things around. So I think the bias is breaking down. But it'll take a little bit more time, and the evidence is piling up. I mean, now they've got these studies of terminal lucidity, which are really remarkable. Or you basically have a phenomenon that has been studied, by the way, very much at Harvard and other well-known medical schools, which are really remarkable. Or you basically have a phenomenon that has been studied, by the way, very much at Harvard and other well-known medical schools, of people who 1 hour to maybe a full day before death, right? These people who had, very, very low brain capacity, right? So they'd experienced severe atrophying of the cerebral cortex, which is where most of our abstract thinking is done, where most of our memory and so forth is done, right? They might have had Alzheimer's, and they were in a severe state of Alzheimer's or dementia, or maybe they were mentally and developmentally challenged, from a very young age, right? An IQ, for example, below 70, and so people thought, well, these people are just incapable of young age, right? An IQ, for example, below 70, and so people thought, well, these people are just incapable of significant, brain activity that could explain, in terms of a physical process, their thinking. Well, suddenly, 1 hour to a day before they die, they wake up, and a person who, may have hydrocephalus, where, they're reduced to 1/10 of their brain, the rest is water, right? Or a person with severe Alzheimer's or dementia suddenly wakes up, and they're as lucid as you and me. I mean, it's just amazing. They wake up, they talk about, well, what happened during their death? Boy, I better get my will in order. Here's what I would like my funeral to look like. Don't worry, I'm okay. Everything's going to be okay. All right. And so in order, here's what I would like my funeral to look like. Don't worry, I'm okay. Everything's going to be okay. All right. And so forth and so on. And they're speaking just like I'm speaking right now. And they were incapable of doing it. I mean, we have MRIs of their brains. I mean, it's just not possible to be doing it through a physical brain. Why not begin to entertain the possibility that it's the same transphysical soul that survives bodily death that we're just talking about, witnessed in near-death experiences? Why wouldn't that also be the explanation for this terminal lucidity? They're not thinking through their brain. They're thinking through something else. What is it? And so those studies of terminal lucidity, all the studies of Naum and Grayson and so forth, they're all cited there. If you go to crediblecatholic.com, just go to Big Book, Volume 2.
Yeah, I'll be sure to link all listening. I know even my family may have seen somebody suffer or pass away, especially from dementia or Alzheimer's, and it can be very difficult. But then you hear of these experiences and these studies, and it really can shed some hope on the situation, and deserved and well evidenced hope as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And those who are mentally, developmentally challenged, I have to tell you, they should be treated with the exact same respect as all of us, not just for Christian ethical reasons, but I mean, because also it is highly, highly likely that they have a transphysical soul that is truly drinking in all these things that you and I are drinking in, except they can't express it through their physical brains. Mm-hmm. And of course, the phenomenon of terminal lucidity, is pointed out where, somebody, they are a poor soul. And as we found out in the case of some remarkable cases, they wake up in the terminal lucidity experience and they are totally articulate. So don't count the developmentally challenged out. These studies are very, very interesting. Michael Naum did a study just on that characteristic alone. But I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, so I just want to be respectful of your time, Father Spitzer, because I have a number of questions that came in from some of the listeners, most of them theological or Catholic specific. But before we get into those, and we could do that kind of rapid fire style.
Sure.
If we need. Is there any other argument or piece of evidence, maybe somebody's listening and they're like, you know what, this is kind of interesting. I'm intrigued. Maybe I'm not completely sold yet, but I'll definitely look more into it. Is there anything else that you would want them to know or think about before we dive into some of these theological questions?
I would just say some of the 21st century and 20th century contemporary scientifically validated miracles. That's on the website there. That's in volume 3. So, of the big book of Credible Catholic. Just go to those miracles. I think some of those Lourdes miracles will blow you away. And by the way, these miracles are attested to not just by people who were formerly people of faith and Catholic. These are people who were agnostic, some of them atheistic, who were placed on the Lourdes Medical Commission. And many of them came to believe in God and in Christ through these miracles. Alexis Carrell, who was the Nobel Prize winner for his work in vascular surgery. He attested to he was people of faith and Catholic. These are people who were agnostic, some of them atheistic, who were placed on the Lourdes Medical Commission, and many of them came to believe in God and in Christ through these miracles. Alexis Carrell, who was the Nobel Prize winner for his work in vascular surgery. He attested to, he was, at the time, strongly agnostic, borderline atheist, and he witnesses this miracle of Marie Bailey, which I describe on the website. But anyway, when he said, I'm open to a miraculous explanation of this miracle, because it was so, phenomenal. And so he just because of his openness, he was thrown out of the medical school at Lyon. He was a professor there. Oh, wow. And phenomenal. And so he just because of his openness, he was thrown out of the medical school at Lyon. He was a professor there. Oh, wow. And of course, later went to the Rockefeller Center, where he won the Nobel Prize for vascular surgery. So shows you, the bias at that time, of at least the medical community in France. But luckily, the Rockefeller Center took him in, and he attested to that and became, a Catholic. And that's just one out of many who have undergone, real transformations by looking at these miracles. But just take a look at those in volume 3 of the big book of Credible Catholic. The other thing I would take a look at is the Shot of Turin. It's way too much to talk about now because we want to get to some questions. But if you want to look at that, go again to volume 3, the most scientifically examined relic that there is. And I have to tell you, the evidence for the resurrection on that shroud is quite remarkable, because there's a perfect 3-dimensional photographic negative image, just really on the very uppermost part of the fibrils of this non-photographically sensitive linen cloth. And the explanation of how that image got there, of this crucified man, crucified in the exact unique way of Jesus Christ, the evidence of Paulo di Lazzaro, and his colleagues, and also several other really important physicists, Jackson and many others, who have done it. These studies are there in Chapter 8, but the main thing is it would have taken 6 to 8 billion of this non-photographically sensitive linen cloth. And when you look at, he did do it with an excimer ARF laser in the laboratory, but in order to produce that total image, it would have taken 14,000 excimer ARF lasers. That's more than the laser capacity of the entire laboratory, of all the laboratories in the entire world right now. You tell me how a dead body emanates 6 to 8 billion watts of light energy. That's more than the laser capacity in the entire world. How does that happen? If you can explain that with a physical cause, as John Jackson would say, well, I'm a physicist. I want to explain things in terms of physical processes, but quite frankly, I'm at a loss. I have no natural causation appeal that I can make left. I'm consternation, which, by the way, is very similar to the gospel reports of Jesus' glorified body. Enough said. I just think Volume 3 would be a fascinating read, at least for people who are open to Christ and Christianity.
Yeah, wonderful. And do you have time for a few questions?
Yeah, I sure do.
Wonderful. Because now we will turn more to the theological, so Catholic specifically. So if you're a Catholic listener, I think you'll find this fruitful. And even if not, I think you'll find it interesting and perhaps even worth looking into a little bit more. So I think the first one will interest absolutely everybody, and it certainly doesn't require somebody to be Catholic to think about it necessarily. It's a question that you probably get as a priest a ton. I think it's a question we all think about at some point if we think about the afterlife. It is the question it says, what will we do in heaven? Does this change? And also, does this change when we are reunited with our resurrected bodies versus when we are disembodied souls?
Well, we are going to be
at some point if we think about the afterlife. It is the question it says, what will we do in heaven? Does this change? And also, does this change when we are reunited with our resurrected bodies versus when we are disembodied souls?
Well, we are going to be, the disembodied souls, do have some things that resemble the gospel features, like Jesus passing through walls and things like that. Our transphysical soul can do things like that. But when we're reunited with our physical, reunited with our embodiment, which will be what St. Paul calls a pneumatikon soma, a spiritual body. When that occurs, we will be glorified. I mean, we will basically not just be, as it were, a transphysical being. We'll be filled with, what St. Paul calls light, glory, and basically not just be, as it were, a transphysical being. We'll be filled with, what St. Paul calls light, glory, and a supernatural splendor that, a transphysical soul doesn't have. But it goes way beyond, the reunification with our bodies. The resurrection will also, be a state of what St. Thomas would call the beatific vision. And there's an articulation of what's called 5 transcendental desires that we have for perfect truth, love, goodness, beauty, and home. Now, essentially, those desires will be fulfilled. So basically, we will have the capacity to understand, right, that the truth as it really is. And we'll know and experience unconditional, and we'll be able to be good in the sense of just and good in a perfect sense, unobscured by, again, our egocentricity and so forth. Additionally, we'll be able to experience perfect beauty and perfect home, where we're in constant state of alienation in this world. We're not at home here, but we're yearning for something beyond this world to bring us to perfection. So, I use Jesus's images if you want to know what heaven's about. He basically says it's about having a loving relationship with people, a perfectly loving relationship with people, where their view of us is unobscured by their ego. Our view of them is unobscured by our ego. And we get to meet trillions upon trillions of these people in all of their glory and their beauty. And of course, when you're in that kind of a perfect love relationship with your friends, and you're just, finished at the meal, you're enjoying a glass of wine, and you just keep on talking, and you keep on talking. You're at your friend's home. Suddenly, it's 2 o'clock in the morning, and somebody blurts out, "Oh my gosh, it's 2 o'clock. Where did the time go?" Mm-hmm. Lost in joy, the joy of an unobscured love. And that's what Jesus is talking about. And it's not just, experiencing this love like at a banquet, at a friend's home, with trillions upon trillions of people. It's also with God himself, with Jesus himself. And so, of course, Jesus is saying, if you really want true joy, we are just lost in the eternity of perfect love, which is such a consummate joy that it elevates us to ecstasy with everybody, enjoyment of everybody, and especially enjoyment.
It absolutely is, and beautifully stated. I want to keep moving here, just so we can attack if you don't mind. All right. So the next one, the question is: I have people in my local Bible study from various denominations who obviously don't agree with essential Catholic teachings, most specifically the need for confession through a priest, and even more importantly than that, the centrality and the real presence of the Eucharist. What would be your advice on how to best present this in a persuasive way to people who are curious?
Okay, that's really a good point. Let me give you some background reading first. Go to that same crediblecatholic.com, but this time go to the big book and click on Module 9. You will have what did Jesus intend in the Holy Eucharist and why the real presence. I mean, if you want to give the simple answer about the big book and click on Module 9, you will have what did Jesus intend in the Holy Eucharist and why the real presence. I mean, if you want to give the simple answer about the Eucharist, well, I would just read John 6. Now, if you can read John 6 and think to yourself that in the early church and in this sacred author's writing, if there's any way you can think that this is not the real body and blood of Jesus Christ, I got to talk to you. It's repeated again and again. This is my real flesh, and my flesh is real food, and this is my real body. It's repeated. I mean, I just don't see how you can possibly give another alternative explanation to John 6. Any scholar, anybody who's going to be a measured, good scholar, a scholarly approach to this. To get out of, the obvious, the utterly obvious. But if you really want to go deeper, go into that chapter 1 where talking about the collapse of time in the ritual, which is really important because the Jewish people did not view time as we view time today. They actually thought that God could actually collapse time so that, if a priest were, saying, do this in memory of me, right. That's the words of Jesus, right. At the Last Supper, when he's going through the rite of this is my body, this is my blood. What's going on is a collapse of time from the present moment back to the past moment when Jesus is at the Last Supper celebrating this, and the actual species of Jesus' gift of body and blood through the Holy Eucharist is there. And the exegetical evidence for this is overwhelming, and I explain it in great detail there in module number 9. With respect to the Sacrament of Reconciliation, you have to say, two things about, the Sacrament of Reconciliation. By the way, there's a lot more to this than what I've said. But anyway, with respect to the reconciliation, first, our prayers for reconciliation are heard by God. Is there, and the exegetical evidence for this is overwhelming, and I explain it in great detail there in module number 9. With respect to the Sacrament of Reconciliation, you have to say, two things about, the Sacrament of Reconciliation. By the way, there's a lot more to this than what I've said. But anyway, with respect to the reconciliation, first, our prayers for reconciliation are heard by God. So, for example, once I was in a plane when I was 16 years old with my buddy. And, we stupidly went from, over a mountainous region right into a region over the ocean. Got caught in a terrible downdraft. Came 100 feet from the wing touching the water, and I would have been great nuts flakes. So what did I do? I did what my catechism, would God hear that prayer of forgiveness sincerely made? Absolutely. There's no question about that. But what do we want to do? We want to have the grace of reconciliation, particularly when we have committed serious sins. And the church defines this very, very precisely. What's called a mortal sin needs to be done. It's not just grave matter, right? It has to be done with sufficient reflection and full consent of the will. That is to say, no impediments to the use of your free will. So it can't be caused by depression, can't be caused by addiction, can't be caused by somebody holding a gun to your head, can't be, a psychological disorder, bipolar, a motivation, et cetera, et cetera. Now, there's a million of these things. Not a million. There's actually about 10 of these things listed in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. You want to get all the scripture quotes for justifying that what's called absolution of the Sacrament of Reconciliation. Go this time to Module 10. So this time you would be going to crediblecatholic.com, Big Book, Module 10. Go down to the chapter on the Sacrament of Reconciliation, and the whole first part of it is the biblical foundations for the sacrament, particularly absolution. And I'll tell you, absolution, that is a guarantee, and it's happening through the priest, and it's for anybody who's done a mortal sin, with sufficient reflection, no impediments to the free use of their will, but just did it. This is such a consolation to be able to get this. Not only that, there are graces that follow upon it that we want to take advantage of. So if you want to read about all of that.
So the next one, it has to deal with suffering, which I know you've written a lot about. So I'm sure you'll have some valuable insights here. And it's very basic. We often hear of the redemptive aspect of suffering. So the question is, how and why should we, quote unquote, offer our suffering up?
Okay. Let me give you again some background material. This time you want to go to the same thing, crediblecatholic.com. You want to go to the Big Book, but this time you want to go to volume 19. The whole thing is on suffering. What are the goods that can come from suffering? How does suffering shock us out of superficiality? How does suffering help us, to turn and deepen our faith in the Lord? How does suffering help us to increase in humility and empathy? How does suffering enable us to serve one another, in their suffering, which of course is the highest act of? How does suffering help us, to turn and deepen our faith in the Lord? How does suffering help us to increase in humility and empathy? How does suffering enable us to serve one another, in their suffering, which of course is the highest act of love called compassion, compassion, right? To suffer with, etc. So all that is discussed, and all the prayers that you can use. So you asked how. Should we pray? And so if you want to get 14 great prayers in times of suffering, they're all right there in that volume.
Great.
But then you specifically said, what about offering up suffering? This is something that Jesus does on the cross, and I explain this in real detail. See, remember the psalm that Jesus quotes,
Great.
but then you specifically said, what about offering up suffering? This is something that Jesus does on the cross, and I explain this in real detail. See, remember the psalm that Jesus quotes when he's on the cross is Psalm 22. Remember, my God, why have you forsaken me? Mm-hmm. Now, some people think that maybe Jesus is having a crisis of faith or a panic attack or something, but that's not the case at all. This is the first line of Psalm 22, and as every Hebrew person in the first century knew, the way you refer to a psalm is by its first line. The cantor sings the first line of the psalm. The people in the congregation go, "Oh yeah, that's that psalm," and they turn to that psalm in the Psalter, and of course they can then respond to the cantor, etc. So he's referring to the entire Psalm 22. But what's it about? Well, first of all, of course, it's an act of trust in God. Off with the lamentation, why have you forsaken me? But I know you trust me, and I know you will vindicate your servant. Right? So it's an act of trust. Then it describes an uncanny description of the suffering. This is written 600 years or more before Jesus' crucifixion, the Psalm, right? And that he's quoting. Yet it has this description of Jesus' crucifixion right in it. I mean, it's just uncanny. And then the third part. This is the solution to what you're asking. Jesus says, I am doing this not only to save, right? So that this is for the salvation, that everyone should come to Yahweh, right? That's the psalmist, but of course, to his heavenly Father. That's Jesus's approach. And he is saying not just the Jewish people, but the Gentile peoples, and not just the people of the present, but all the people who went down to Sheol in the past, right? The place of the dead, and all the people who will come, every generation. That's why he's doing it. And if you look at that citation from John 15, right, there is no greater love. I think it's 15:12, 15:13, right in there. There is no greater love that a person can have than to give his life for his friends, his whole self for his friends. There's the self-sacrificial act. No greater love, unconditional love. You can't exceed it, right? This is the love that he is bringing into the world. So his self-sacrificial act is bringing this unconditional act of love into the world, which we can tap into, right? It's infinite. It's unrestricted love. It's going to outshine every sin that anybody can commit, so long as we sincerely ask for that love, that forgiveness that he has given us through his self-sacrifice. Well, guess what? As Paul says in the letter to the Colossians, I think it's I'm going to say it's chapter 1. He says, I count, it a blessing that I'm suffering, because I can make up for what is lacking in the sufferings of Christ. Now, when I was a young man, I thought, wait, what possibly could be lacking in the sufferings of Christ? I mean, this doesn't make any sense to me. Well, you got to know the Greek. And again, a long story short, if you know the Greek, it means I get to do, what Christ did, because Christ left some space, some room in his plan for me to join in and become part of that self-sacrificial love, which is going to redeem not only, the lives of my friends and so forth, but also for anybody who is in need of redemption, any sins in need of reparation, anybody who is suffering at this time, so I can offer up my sufferings. He pleases to redeem not only the souls of my friends and family, but to also redeem the world. And so we can join in that sacrifice. So yes, let not one single scintilla of suffering go wasted. The best thing you can do is to offer it up in the morning, or if you're experiencing suffering, right then and there, just say, I join my sufferings to those of your Son, dear Lord. Dispose of it wholly according to your will, and especially for whoever it may be, my mom, my dad, or whoever it may be, and that are special in your lives. And Jesus is going to use that in every imaginable way. The Father's going to use that in every imaginable way. And nothing goes wasted to get to salvation, redemption, reparation, everything. And so it's just a blessing. And how do you do it? dear Lord, dispose of it wholly according to your will, and especially for whoever it may be, my mom, my dad, or whoever it may be, and that are special in your lives. And Jesus is going to use that in every imaginable way. The Father's going to use that in every imaginable way. And nothing goes wasted to get to salvation, redemption, reparation, everything. And so it's just a blessing. And how do you do it? Just go to volume 19 of the big book, IncredibleCatholic.com.
People are going to be spending plenty of time with that big book, I hope. So let's turn now to the final one. I think this is salient and important. And the question is, Father, and this is something that even in my experience, and part of the reason I wanted to bring this question to you is because there were so many years that I avoided even looking at the Catholic faith because my experience, and part of the reason I wanted to bring this question to you is because there were so many years that I avoided even looking at the Catholic faith because of what is often the public perception of it. And this question is asking, the church has always been in some crisis or another, but how do you get people to still see the truth and beauty in Catholicism when we are in the current crisis and there's so much corruption and scandal going on?
Okay. There's just three things you have to remember right from the get-go. Number one, you have to judge the church according to her saints and not her sinners. We've got our fair share of sinners. Poor Jesus, he only had a band of 12 apostles, and one of them was going to betray him. Why is that? Because the church, Jesus' apostles, have free will. You just can't get around it. We don't, saints are not, there are many attempts, to overcome their ego, their sensuality, etc. So yes, I totally agree. The scandals are something that it's terrible. We need to deal with it. The church needs to deal with it. We have to be more transparent. We've got to work on this thing. I'm praying for this February meeting. However, we cannot judge the church on the basis of her sinners, but rather on the basis of her saints, where you have truly extraordinary love. And there's just saint after saint after saint after saint. Just put in, Catholic lives of saints into Google. I mean, there have to be truly hundreds upon hundreds of hagiographies out there. Old ones, new ones, very recent ones. I mean, where you get the witness of what's happened, the transformation that has taken place with people through their lives. Through their faith and through their share of sinners. Absolutely, we do. No denying it. But, at least judge the church on her saints rather than saints. The second thing is we need the church, right? The idea here is maybe I'll see a cardiologist one day and say, hey, look, that cardiologist is eating terribly, lots of red meat and fat and sugar, and he never gets any exercise. That does it. He's a scandal to the profession. I'm going to stop going to cardiologists. Bad idea. The point, of course, is why would you turn down this source of in this case, I'm switching back to the church now. Why would you turn down a source of grace, the source of constant help of the Holy Spirit, this font of teaching, right? This community that helps us out of that, because some people, in their free choice, even those who had elected to be, right, a priest or something, why would you do that? Cutting off your nose to spite your face. We need the church, and the Eucharist is transformative. Sacrament of Reconciliation is transformative. The teaching, authority of the church is absolutely necessary. I mean, my gosh, without it, you're going to have a sheer proliferation of churches in 2 seconds. So my point that I'm trying to get to is you don't want to cut off your nose to spite your face. Don't leave the font of grace simply because some people abuse their free choice and were errant. The third thing is really important, and that is, why would you stay? Because Jesus promised in Matthew The point that I'm trying to get to is you don't want to cut off your nose to spite your face. Don't leave the font of grace simply because some people abuse their free choice and were erring. The third thing is really important, and that is, why would you stay? Because Jesus promised in Matthew 16:18 that the gates of the netherworld would never prevail against it. And I think that promise has been kept. Now, if you want to know why I think that is a very significant and authentic logion of Jesus, again, go to crediblecatholic.com, go to the big book, and this time go to volume 6. I take a very long and lengthy look at that logion, why it's an authentic logion, and why I truly believe that that even people who started off as agnostics, right, who were, I give a series of historians, right, who started off as agnostics, who came to the conclusion that the Catholic Church is the longest standing institution of any kind, right, in the history of humankind. And it is the most amazing historical paradox. Why has it lasted over 2,000 years? Why is it still producing its saints? Why does, and you say, well, church membership is decreasing. Not all over the world it is not decreasing. Yes, in the United States it is, but there's not a reason, in my view, for that to occur if we are teaching the truth and we're giving good example as Pope Francis is doing. I think at the end of the day, what we have to look at is, well, how can this possibly be? And if you read that volume 6, you can see that it's, I think, due to supernatural grace. I think it's attributable to the fact that Jesus kept his promise. He did not let the gates of the netherworld, that is to say, the gates of Hades, prevail in any way against the church. Yes, the devil has had his way with some priests and some lay people and some crusaders and some other historical individuals, for sure, all the way through. But for sure, if you look at the long-standing nature, the grace-filled nature, the ever-increasing nature, and of course the testimony after testimony as to the benefits of the Holy Eucharist, the Sacrament of Reconciliation, the church community, and the church majesty.
She got baptized last Easter, has been the single most transformative and important event of our life. So anything we can do to perhaps get people interested or thinking about that, and to share what cannot even be properly described, the gift that has been given to us with other people's would be a great joy to me. So I thank you for your extremely generous time and this absolutely fascinating discussion. I knew, like I said, I didn't even know where to begin, but we kind of touched on just about everything, and I could listen to you to go off for hours, as I usually do on EWTN. So I have to say it's an absolute pleasure to have gotten to talk with you. And I just want to, give you a few minutes here if you want to just remind people or direct people again of the various resources that you've put out, and the best way is to consume those resources or to follow along with everything you're doing, please.
Sure. Well, again, if you just go to, we discussed volumes 1, 2, 3, 6, and 19. So those are the ones you'd want to take a look at from today's discussion. I have several books that deal with this in a little lengthier way. New Proofs for the Existence of God, Contributions of Contemporary Physics and Philosophy. Another book called The Soul's Upward Yearning, and that's evidence of our transphysical nature from experience and reason. And then a third one on suffering called The Light Shines On in the Darkness, Transforming Suffering Through Faith. There's all kind, if you want to know about the Shot of Turin and the historical arguments for Jesus, just go to God So Loved the World, about the Shot of Turin and the historical arguments for Jesus, just go to God So Loved the World. Transcendental Destiny from the Revelation of Jesus. And so these are some books to get you started.
And once again, I will be sure to link all of those. I have the entire quartet and all your other books too. They're all fantastic. I can't recommend them highly enough. So I will be sure to link those all in the show notes for people who want to dive a little bit deeper. I would love to have you on again, Father Spitzer, and I hope.
Anytime that the need arises. But thank you, Pat Flynn. You're doing great work.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.